Okay, it is 9:32, so I'm just going to ask Susie to do a formal welcome, and then I'll do some notes before we get right to Martin. Susie?
I don't see her. Maybe she dropped off.
Did she drop off? She might have had an internet. Okay, I'm going to start and just say welcome to all of you from all over the world. I think Susie mentioned we have 19 countries calling in this morning, and people will continue to come on as the minutes pass. I'm going to give you a few instructions for Zoom if you're not familiar with it before we get to our esteemed master for today's class. So Beatrice has muted all of you now. When you want to speak, just move your cursor to the bottom left of the Zoom window. You'll see a microphone icon with a line through it. Click it, unmute yourself, say what you would like to say, and then please mute yourself again. That just keeps the call much cleaner in terms of audio. When you speak for the first time, please say your name, your company, and your country. That's all we need to hear so that everybody can kind of place you globally. And if you want to see the glorious global mosaic that I see on my screen, then on the top right of your Zoom window, choose the gallery view. And that gives you the kind of checkerboard of participants, which is really, really fun to see. And the only other thing I'll say about Zoom is that there is a chat function. So the bottom center of your Zoom window, if you just click chat, a screen opens to your right, a little window opens. And in that window, you can type a question for Martin, you can have a comment. We pay attention to those as the call goes on. And sometimes, you know, we refer to those or try to get to your questions after. You'll have a chance to ask questions live, but sometimes as things come up, you want to put them in that window and we can address them. We're going to get to as many of you as we can for questions. But without further ado, I just want to introduce you to Martin Palmer, who is our master for today's class. He's a theologian, a scholar, author, broadcaster, environmentalist. He's president of FaithInvest, where he helps all faiths move their investments into programs that have social value and align with the values of their faith. Martin was, I would say, one of the most popular and controversial speakers at our summit in Singapore last year because he kind of took us all to task for not including faith in the global wellness conversation on a broad scale. And he really woke us up. And what Susie and I are finding is that on a lot of the calls we've been having, faith has come up as a topic. So we invited Martin to come here and talk to us about wellness and faith, particularly at this critical time in the world. Martin?
Thank you, all of you, for joining this afternoon, this morning, or this evening, or tomorrow, depending on where you are, really. It's a very great honor. I have to say, when I came back from your summit in Singapore, my wife said, "What happened?" And I said, this was just the most energetic, the most positive, the most engaged group I have been with for years. And bear in mind, I am an advisor to the royal family. I'm an advisor to WWF International. I'm an advisor to the United Nations. You lot eclipsed them all by your sheer enthusiasm and the fact you were doing things. It was so encouraging. You also had a wonderful sense of humor. Usually I'm the only one making jokes at events, and I felt completely outgunned by many of your speakers, which was fantastic, because I do think that if it isn't worth laughing about, it's probably not worth believing in. So I came back brimming with excitement, so much so that, and this is a little bit of name dropping here, I have to say, when the Pope asked if I would be one of his senior advisors on what the Catholic Church, and he in particular, should do in plans for the post-COVID-19 world, I said, well, yes, okay, I'll join, but I want my friends to come as well. And so Nancy had, I think, a long call with the Vatican last week, and they have now built, for the first time ever, they have built the notion of wellness, not just health, but wellness into the Catholic Church's program for the future. And an extraordinary situation, because normally any new developments within the Vatican happen by a process of going through different ministries and eventually ending up with the Secretary of State, which is rather like one of those dark alleys you go down and get mugged. And this time the Pope has said, this is so important, I will decide, and when I've decided, it will be policy. So I'm seriously, you lot inspired me, and now you're inspiring the Vatican. So there we go. What do I mean by faith? What I mean by faith is something that I think all of you actually have, though I'm not sure you actually have the confidence to name it, nor do I think you yet have the confidence to reach out to others who are more confident than you are that it's worth naming. Now, there's a wonderful piece of sort of Rumsfeld language, isn't it? What I mean by that is, faith is actually believing that you live in a bigger story than just yourself, or your family, or your nation, or even just the human race. Faith is that you are caught up in a drama, a story that is cosmic, a story that is about the whole of life on earth, a story that has a purpose. It has a direction. It doesn't mean that it always achieves what it sets out to do, but it has a sense of direction, and it has a sense of inspiration. And the greatest story, or stories, because I'm not interested in one story. If you look at the world, we've tried to have monolithic belief systems, whether that was Christianity or Islam, or whether it was Marxism or capitalism or democracy or whatever it is. We've tried to have universal stories, and they don't work. We're far too contrary. And I'm a theologian, but I've spent the last 40 years working with every major environmental group around the world, developing environmental programs with the faiths, literally in every country around the world. And what I've learned from the environmentalists is that evolution, creation, nature, whatever you want to call it, because they're all just stories, whatever you want to call it, it is only capable of dealing with crises because it's got diversity. Biodiversity is fundamental to how evolution, nature, creation is able to grow, continue, deal with collapses and so forth. Well, I'm a Christian, and if God is behind all this, and God quite likes diversity in nature, then I suspect that she also quite likes diversity in our intellectual thinking. So the desperate attempt to make one plan for the planet and one scheme, let's save the planet, let's join WWF, or let's save the planet and join TNC, or whatever it is, are doomed to fail, because actually they are all built in with so many flaws. So what I like is stories. I love the fact that we live by stories. Now, Nancy and I have conversed a number of times. I know a little bit about her grandchildren. I know a little bit about how she got to be in this job, you know, who she had to bribe, how many people she actually had rubbed out on the way, you know, just little details like that that just so enrich a person's relationship. She has never told me how old she is. She's never told me how much she weighs. She's never told me how many calories she had for breakfast. As a source of data and information, she is a complete and utter waste of space. But I've got to know and love her deeply, because I know some of her stories and she knows some of mine. So we are actually a narrative species. We're not a data species. I'm a theologian, for God's sake. We've been trying to get 1 into 3 and 3 into 1 for the last 2,000 years in the Trinity, and we still haven't achieved it. So don't come to us for data. We are a storytelling species, and what we need to have confidence in, is faith in, is the story that we inhabit. And therefore also that those stories engage with other stories. And there will be some stories we will engage with that we frankly want to get rid of. I wouldn't want to mention anybody's president at the moment, because obviously that would be inappropriate. But, you know, there are narratives that we don't necessarily wish to be part of. And in fact, that we would want to challenge. There are other narratives that we actually can learn from. So for me, faith is actually having a sense that there is a greater story that I am part of, that there are greater stories that I want to be engaged with, there are greater stories that I am prepared to oppose, and that there are values that then flow from that. And those greater stories can be specifically faith ones. They can be ones based in the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita or the Talmud, but they can also be stories that come out of our cultures, out of our families, out of our backgrounds. But what they all have to have is a sense that we are significant in our insignificance within the bigger story. That is what I think faith is. And I think also, just to finish this intro, one of the things I loved about what you were all doing, I've worked with the environmental movement for over 40 years. And one of the big areas that we've done a lot of work on is helping many religions own farmland and forestry as part of their investment portfolios. And what I've done with them is to get them to move into, for example, FSC for forestry work, Forest Stewardship Council. And we've helped many hundreds of thousands of religiously owned farms move into organic farming and subsidize that. So what I'm intrigued with is the values that drive why we do the better things that we do. And in many, many parts of the world, those values will be faiths. They will be religions. Most places in the world do not trust their government. They do not trust NGOs. They do not trust the UN because they know they will disappear when the times get rough. Every single major faith in the world has seen us through plagues, through famines, through wars, through civil wars, through complete collapses of ecology. They've got some wisdom. It's worth looking at. And I'll just give you two very brief bits, if I may. One is from the Daodejing. I'm a China scholar. I read classical Chinese because I get bored very easily. And I've translated many of the great classics of China. So I'm just going to read you this from chapter 4 of the Daodejing, because this is the greater story of Chinese culture, whether they are communist Chinese, capitalist Chinese, Buddhist Chinese, Christian Chinese or not. So chapter 4 of the Daodejing. The Tao pulls out everything into life. It is a cornucopia that never runs dry. It is the deep source of everything. It is nothing, and yet it is everything. It smooths round sharpness and untangles the knots. It glows like the lamp that draws the moth. Tao exists. Tao is. But where it came from, I do not know. It has been shaping things from before the first being, from before the beginning of time. So that's the Taoist notion. The Christian one that I want to share is from the Gospel of Matthew, and it's basically, what strength does your story give you? And it comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7. Therefore, everyone, this is Jesus speaking, therefore everyone who listens to these words of mine and acts on them will be like a sensible man who builds his house on rock. Rain came down, floods rose, gales blew and hurled themselves against the house, and it did not fall because it was founded on rock. But everyone who listens to these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a stupid man who builds his house on sand. Rain came, floods rose, gales blew and struck the house, and it fell. And what a fall it had. Well, in a world in which we are watching what we thought was sustainable and workable collapse, I think that's fairly wise. And that's what faith brings to this. Wisdom, experience, history, and vision. And I'd love to discuss that with you.
Martin, thank you so much for all of that and for the extraordinary project that we are indeed engaged in now with the Vatican. And I will say that this Jewish girl was on the call with the Vatican on the first day of Passover. So life is an unusual journey. I would like to just now open it up. I'm sure there are lots of people who would like to contribute, ask questions of Martin. David, did I see your hand go up? David Stewart? No, okay. Who would like, if you would like to speak, please just unmute yourself, lower left of your screen, and go ahead. Is everyone just weepy like I am from Martin?
Hello, I'm Margaret from Brazil, Lapinha Spa. Hi.
No. Hello there.
Hello. It's just great to have this, your word telling us how important it is to have our own story having a significant meaning in the whole. So that pulls us out of our individuality. And it's also great to hear the Taoist saying that is very similar to Genesis also, the beginning or
Yeah.
John Gospel in the beginning. So it's wonderful to have this universal possibility that our own stories, they can match in some degree to other stories in the world. And that universality, that we are narrative species, that we can tell our story, that's great. And then it's good to know that we can build upon a rock. I mean, we can review our foundations. And that's great. That's a great opportunity. We don't have to throw everything away, because many of what we are doing, many things are wonderful. And the wisdom now is to see how to move on and really select what is pure rock. And I think we could move on to practical values. What are these foundational rocks that we can build wellness service to the world? What we can bring? How can we contribute to the post-COVID new world? With
Margaret,
really,
thank you. I'm going to just interrupt so that we can get to
yes,
a number of questions, and maybe, you know, Martin can address that, and then we can get to some other questions for him.
Nancy?
Yes, Alina.
Good morning, Martin. I would love to ask Martin what his opinion or his views on human volition. We all have volition, and I would really love to hear your take on that, please.
Nancy, if I could interrupt, let's have Martin address the first question, perhaps, because that was an important one that I think we all would like to hear, and then we can move on.
Yep.
I have a hard time remembering more than one question at a time. Although Martin, I'm sure you don't, so please go ahead.
No, Susie, that does help. Thank you. I mean, why did I come back so enthusiastic from Singapore? I came back because I heard people who were putting their creativity, their finances, their skills at the service of bigger pictures. And I think particularly, well, there were three things. I think there was the whole thing about organic food and organic restaurants, organic catering, and so forth. And then there was, not dissimilar, there was the whole issue of sustainable fabric. And that, my wife has just finished writing a book on the history of fabric. So we've been kind of living with that all around the house. You know, she's been to Papua New Guinea for bark cloth and Gee's Bend for quilts and so forth. And I was intrigued by that. And then the third one was that you'd set up this whole commission on mental wellness, and particularly addressing this kind of eco-fear that was coming from so many quarters, and that was actually making it impossible for people to be hopeful enough to make changes. And what I came away with was a sense that here were values that you all kind of embraced in one way or another. What I challenged you about at that event, and I would challenge you about it still, and Margaret's point about rocks, finding, you know, building stronger on your rocks, is I suspect in many cases, it was almost like a sort of emotional response. Of course it should be organic. Of course it should be vegan, for example, or cruelty-free. Of course it should be fabric that is sustainable and not thrown away after the first wearing. And of course it should be that we should be caring. We should be presenting a vision of the world that is hopeful, that actually enables people to feel they have a role and a place in it. But what I didn't sense was that you felt a confidence in actually digging deeper and saying, why do I care for that? You were tremendous on how to do things. But the trouble with how to do things is that when a fashion change comes, you don't have the rock that you're founded on. You haven't got those values perhaps to go back to. I think you all have. But I think we've grown up, and I think particularly younger generations than me, have grown up with a kind of deep skepticism and uncertainty about any system that seems to be saying, well, this is true, or this is absolute, or this is fundamental, or this is core, because we fear that that might in some way inhibit our own creativity. I saw enormous creativity. I would love for you in this lockdown time to just go deeper and excavate what is it that made me do this. And I'll give you one very simple example of how this works. I was invited by President Hollande of France when they were holding the Paris COP in 2015, which was a make or break moment and for the climate change. And I was called in to change the culture of the COP. And the culture of these huge meetings, 25,000 representatives, I mean, it's a nonsense thing, was to come with your government commitments and say, well, this is what we're going to do. We'll put this much money into a green bank, and we're going to cut back our CO2 emissions by the end of the third millennium. You know, we're going to do what we can. And Holland said, what can we do to change the culture? And I said, well, would you be prepared to write a personal letter to every head of state coming and say to them, could you just come primarily as a human being? And can you tell me why you personally care? And I said, if we get 10% replying, that will be amazing, and you'll know who will go the extra mile. We got a quarter of all the heads of state replied with personal stories. One of them from a Muslim country said, my grandfather was an imam. He used to take me into the forest and he would point at the trees and the leaves and he would say, those are the words of God. Others would have had a moment in nature that had transformed them, that opened a sense that they were part of something greater. Until you've dug down and remembered why you care and looked at the roots of that, maybe you aren't as fully alive to the possibilities as you could be otherwise. So I agree. That's why I put in that quote about the rock. Dig down through all the foundations, through all the cellars, through all the wine store, through all the places where you stored all the stuff that you meant to sort out and give to the charity shop but never got round to, and find the rock. Now, human volition.
Yes.
Oh man, you didn't warn me about that one, Nancy.
May I?
Yeah.
Yes. Hi, I am Andrea Parodi, and I produce ingredients for cosmetics. And it's very interesting what you're telling to me, because I start to work with organic product, and then now we are working on the biodiversity scale, because I think the most important things that we can do here is just to look at what we use for ingredients.
Andrea, I'm sorry, excuse me, this is Nancy. We're gonna try to stay, so Martin has a question from Alina. Let's just try to stay with the question and then we'll come to you right after that. Thank you.
And if you could word it as a real question for me, that would be so helpful.
Yes, Alina, let's go back to you, and why don't you reword your question or just state it again. So
Hey, give me a clue, Alina.
Okay, I'm always curious of what is beneath volition. What is the thing that human beings, we have the capacity to do, which is comprised of choice, the will, and ultimately consciousness. So I am really curious to hear your view on human volition, past, present, and future.
That's what I like, a simple, limited question. One of the great struggles I think we have, particularly in the Western world, is that we don't trust our own will and our own volition. We have been taught by a particular perversion of Christianity that came in the 5th century under Augustine of Hippo to believe in original sin. The Orthodox Church does not believe in original sin. The Church of the East does not believe in original sin. I'm an Anglican. We don't believe in original sin because God is obviously English, so she's going to let us in anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But seriously, the Jews do not believe in original sin. They have the same story of Adam and Eve. The Muslims do not believe in original sin. They have the same story of Adam and Eve. We need to liberate ourselves from a very perverse tradition that came in from Zoroastrianism, that the world is split between forces of good and bad, and recognize the Chinese model of diversity, which is that they complement and that they are in conflict with each other. In the yin-yang model, yin and yang is often described as a model of harmony. Well, it's not. If yin could overtake yang, if autumn and winter could actually get control and we could have cold all the year round, where yin would kind of go, yay, got it. And yang, if it could get spring and summer to be all year round. And in fact, the two great cosmic stories, myths of China, was when there were 9 suns and yang ran the world and everything died. And then there's the yin sequence, which is when the world was flooded and everything died. So yin and yang are in conflict, but out of that conflict comes the capacity for life. Neither is good, neither is bad, except in excess. But we've grown up in the West with a burden of a belief in original sin, that we're not good enough, that we're always failing, we're fallible. I think we have to shake that one off vigorously. I think we have to recognize that we can be incredibly stupid. We can be incredibly selfish. We can be incredibly greedy, but that we also know that there is a counterpoise to that. There is compassion, there is generosity, and so forth. I think for me, we've just had Easter. And there is a wonderful, the Orthodox Church, the churches of the East, have one icon for Easter. It's not the empty tomb. It's not Jesus rising from the tomb. It's Easter Saturday. And on Easter Saturday, according to Christian legend, Christ descended into hell and he smashed down the gates of hell. The icon shows the gates falling and forming the shape of an Orthodox baptismal font. And there's bolts and bits of hinge flying everywhere, and Christ strides in, and with his right hand he raises Adam and all the good men of the past, regardless of what they believed, and with his left hand he raises Eve and all the good women of the past, regardless of what they believed, because it's about what you do and what motivates you to do that brings, if you like, salvation, liberation, redemption, not falling on your knees, beating your chest and saying, oh, woe is me, woe is me. And I think one of the things that we've learned from psychology is that the woe is me, beat myself, you know, I'm a sinner, is crippling. And I watch with horror the major environmental organizations basically playing on apocalypse, sin, guilt as a motivation, and fear as a motivation for change. It does not work. We are still retreading in many secular forms an old myth that we're fundamentally bad. And the most we can hope is that we'll be less bad. I want to turn that on its head. The earliest Christian who basically fought that was a monk called Pelagius in the 4th, 5th century, who was British. And he said, no, if we're children of God, how can we be fundamentally bad? We're not. Does that help?
Martin, thank you so much. I want to go to Andrea. And Andrea, do you have a question for Martin? That would be great to get right to if you unmute.
Okay, sorry. I was, because you spoke about faith and then you spoke about biodiversity. So you connect the faith from a side that is helping everybody else to be, you know, stay better. Because if we are faith also in ourselves, you know, that is the first person that we should, you know, consider most. Because if we are, like you say, son of God, we have a piece of God inside of us. So we really have to look after that. We have potential, something good. And in this day, I think the people, if the fear move away from the faith. So if you have a lot of fear, you cannot be focused. And I think that when we pray, when we do, you know, whatever exercise, that we are focused in the moment, we start to have faith, and we are present in what we are doing. There is a story in Italy that they tell
Andre,
about.
I'm just going to interrupt to ask if you have a question for Martin, because there are a lot of people wanting to ask.
Okay, yes, but I was, introducing.
I think Andre's question is about the individual within this huge diversity, and I'll just share very quickly something. Within many faiths, and it's best articulated in the Christian tradition by the Franciscans, they talk about four relationships, four fundamental relationships, which you have to get, not you have to get right, but which have to be aligned if you're going to actually be fully human and fully aware. The first one is your relationship with the divine, whatever you understand that to be, God, the gods, the Buddha, the Tao, your relationship with the transcendent, with the greater than. The second one is your relationship with your neighbor, using that in Jesus's sense of anybody in need, anybody around you. The third relationship is with nature, with the rest of creation, the rest of life on earth. And the final one is your relationship with yourself. You need all four of those. And I see in the movement, the wellness movement, I see the caring for the other. I see the caring for the earth and the way that you're all producing things that are sustainable. I sometimes see caring for yourselves, but I think all of us in the caring world sometimes sacrifice ourselves more than we can give. And then I think the final one that I found people were unsure as to its validity is the relationship with the greater story, the transcendent story. So I think you're absolutely right about the individual. Don't be frightened of caring for yourself, but it has to be in that context of the other three relationships as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you so much. I know, Darlene, where are you? You have a question for Martin.
Here, I'm here. Hi, Martin. It's good to see you again. And thank you for being on here, and for Susie and Nancy for bringing you to us today. You're a gem. I weep every time I hear you speak. I can't help it. The tears just come. And I've been chatting with other people, and they say the same thing. I mean, we love you. So
Please
my question is,
Darlene, just introduce yourself. Thanks.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I'm Darlene Fisk. I'm the co-founder of Swell Public Relations. My other cohort is Kim Marshall. She's not here today, but if she were, she would tell you to go listen to the podcast with Martin Palmer. Okay, that's all.
Thank you for that.
Excellent plug.
My question for you is about language and storytelling. I love that, we also say that in PR, we are storytellers, and all of us are. And so what types of language should we be using as we, the world is on lockdown. So what types of language should be talking about or using as we move out of this and start to get back to some sort of normalcy? Like, what do people need to hear? And from your perspective, what would be some powerful words we could be using?
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question indeed. I mean, first and foremost, one of the things I have to deal with is I deal with conservation groups, environmental groups, scientists, economists. I deal with UN, I deal with World Bank, and they come at me with gobbledygook, language that they've invented, ecosystem deliverables, for Christ's sake. Basically what they mean is nature, but only as useful to us. So one of the first rules that we have in every organization I've ever set up is we never ever use a word unless you can show that it's been used in a poem. Because if it hasn't been used in a poem, nobody loves it. Nobody finds any depth or meaning or symbolism in it. And by poems, I don't just mean the great poems, but they kind of help. So first and foremost, let's cut out the language which is designed to make it sound as though we know what we're talking about, and you don't. Therefore, you've got to listen to me and do what I want you to do. So don't use words that you cannot show me a major poet or even a minor poet, but one who has touched and moved you has used. So that's fundamental. One of the great difficulties is the misuse of language. I have just had a lengthy debate with WWF International, World Wildlife Fund International, who constantly will say that they are fighting against climate change. And I go, I'm sorry, who are you fighting? So I'm sorry, why this language of a battle? when what you're actually concerned about is about the wonderful, gorgeous diversity of life on Earth that you want to protect. Now that I'm drawn to. You want me to battle against climate change? I mean, you know, what's that language? And as we've discussed recently, Darlene, the language of social isolation, why don't we call it a retreat? Why don't we call it a period of solitude, a period of silence? So the very language we use to describe things often actually undermines what it is that we're trying to say. And I will give you another famous example. I've talked about biodiversity, which basically in my book just means loads of nature. Loads and loads of nature, loads and loads of birds and loads of trees and loads of grass and loads of mountains and rivers and streams. But, you know, okay, the environmental world calls it biodiversity. And when they launched, when the major environmental groups back in the late 90s launched the whole program on biodiversity is essential for the planet, they had a big press launch. They had a huge banner, biodiversity, the future of the planet. And underneath it were seated 4 middle-aged white men who announced how important it was to have diversity. So I think we have to be incredibly careful with language. I think we have to be incredibly thoughtful with language. And I think we have to use poetry way more than we do. We've always, at all the events I've ever done, I've had a poet, an artist, a composer, and a musician. And nobody ever reads a paper that was delivered at a conference. Well, Nancy, except of course your papers, of course. I mean, we all read them. In fact, we have them framed on the wall and we worship them every morning, but that's another story. But our poems, our music, our paintings have been used hundreds of times. So you know better than anybody else what attracts people. It's stories, it's visual, it's engageable, it's language that is about engagement. I'm tired of battles and campaigns and fighting. I like generosity, compassion, outreach, and you lot did exactly that.
That's incredible, and it's a wonderful way to view, to change the narrative. Don Ardell, were you raising your hand to speak, I think? You're muted, so you need to unmute, bottom left. Thank you, Don.
For starters, Martin, thank you for being here and for many of your good ideas. I am Don Ardell from Florida, US, and just have a question about your remarks on faith. Consider there are a handful of major religions today and thousands of others as well. All make different faith and other claims. All can't be true. Only one could be true. And that might be an overestimation. Most religions, like Catholicism that I experienced growing up, claim they alone are the one true religion. So then what? Isn't following creeds and dogmas that rely on faith, which, by the way, is not defined as, quote, believing something bigger than yourself, rather than relying on evidence, a superstition? Do we really need, quote, lessons faith can teach us during a global pandemic, or any time for that matter? And can we define words like faith any way we choose, or do words have common meanings that we should respect? Mark Twain, for example, said, faith is believing what you know ain't so. So what do you think?
That was very much Mark Twain. Also, rumors of my death are greatly overstated.
Yes.
Another lovely one of that one. I love that one. I think, you see, the interesting thing is that what you're positing is that there is one true story, which is probably more about science but many would. And I think one of our problems is we need to actually celebrate diversity. We have feared diversity in the Western world because we're inheritors of the Greek model, which was that the monad, there is the absolute truth, and a great deal of Greek philosophy was trying to define, to give language to the absolute, which of course is a little bit daft because if it's absolute, it's beyond language. But that has fed into many of our Western traditions, political, economic, as well as religious, that if only everybody would believe the same, then we could save the planet. We could be in harmony. My argument is that fundamentally, that is a flawed understanding of the place of greater narratives. We need that diversity. There are huge gifts within every faith. And there are huge problems within every faith, but there are huge problems within every ideology as well. What we need is an ability not so much to shop amongst faiths, but as it were, to find what it is that resonates with us, and then to actually celebrate what we learn from others. When we did the first event of bringing the major religions together with the environmental movement in 1986 in Assisi, Prince Philip said to me, "So how do we get them all to agree?" And I said, we don't want them all to agree, because, you know, look at what we all agreed about in the past, which has ended us up in the mess in the first place. Why don't we invite people to come proud of their own tradition, but humble enough to listen? And the vast majority of people in the world fall into that category. We hear about the fundamentalists, we hear about the extremists, and I deal with extremists and fundamentalists as much in the environmental movement as I do in religious world. But I'm always reminded of a wonderful comment one of my tutors at Cambridge said. He said, where does most of the noise come from in a swimming pool? It's the shallow end. Well, that's the same with faith and ideologies and beliefs. It's the noise comes from the shallow end. The vast majority are not in the shallow end.
Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful analogy too. Anybody else with a question for Martin? I'm looking at both screens. If you have a question, please unmute and go ahead and ask it, and then I will. Oh yes, okay. Anna from Raison d'Être.
Yes, hello, Anna Corey from Raison d'Être in Sweden. I'm wondering a little bit about where we are now and the different words, faith, destiny, and hope, and how you see them all relate or maybe be very different from each other.
That's a very interesting question. For many people, I think what they want from religion, or what they want from horoscopes, or what they want from predictions, is to be removed from being responsible for their own actions. And for many people, there is a sense, they quite like the feeling that their destiny is preset, that fate is preset, because in a sense that takes away individual personal responsibility, and therefore the ambiguity and the complexity of making choices. I think I like the way you put it, faith, destiny, hope, because it seems to me that faith and hope actually go together if you take out this notion of destiny. Because I think in most cases, destiny means that you have a fairly inflexible notion of what ought to happen, either to you or to the world or what have you. And I listen, I'm on a number of international groups at the moment talking about what comes out of this crisis. Groups with the UN, the World Bank, the Vatican, Religions for Peace, various other organizations, investment groups as well. And there is a real fear that people will just go back to what they did before, that we will all kind of give a huge sigh of relief and say, oh, thank God, we're back to life as normal. But we can't do that, because the normal life was so abnormal, it's got us in this crisis in the first place. So our destiny is not to go back to what it was before. Our hope is maybe that we can go back to what it was before. Our faith is that maybe everything will go back to being as it was before, but we need to subvert that. And faith and hope are great subversive forces, because if you hope, let's take a very simple example. Friends of mine have run Compassion in World Farming for 40 years. When they started, nobody cared about battery chickens. Nobody cared about pigs being kept in rooms so small they couldn't turn round. Nobody cared about the quality of life for many, many animals. Now, over the years, slowly, painfully, painstakingly, they've brought in legislation in the European Union, they've brought in legislation in national governments, they've created a whole market of compassionate food purchasing, of compassionate farming. When they started, they had faith that human beings could be changed. They had the hope that they could change things, and they've done it. If they had had a destiny that it ought to happen, they probably would have gone and killed people or blown up things in order to make sure the destiny happened. So I think for me, and they are wonderful people from all sorts of religious and non-religious backgrounds in that movement, they had faith that we were changeable. They had hope that we would change. They found the ways of showing us that we could be hopeful and have faith that we were changeable. If we had set out thinking it was their destiny, then all the setbacks would have only led to greater and greater anger. I'm very struck, and I was incredibly moved at the summit by the work that was being done on dealing with eco-fear amongst young people. As a historian of religion, as well as a theologian, I know that when groups start using apocalyptic language, that is when they start to believe it is right to kill, hurt, maim in order to get their goals. Destiny is often part of that.
Martin, thank you. Another question from someone that we've not heard from before. Yes, Kiki Carlson up there at the top of my screen, if you would unmute.
Hi, so I'm Kiki Carlson, Drum UK from the UK.
Okay.
I just wanted to ask why you think there is so little in the media about how we stop spread of these horrible viruses, instead of just talking about how to get rid of them. So my feeling is that obviously we need to change the world, and asking the reasons why we're getting these viruses. And there's lots of people are doing it, but why do you think the media and the press do not seem to want to talk about it?
Can you just clarify, because you mean they're not talking about stopping it, they're just talking about controlling it? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it doesn't seem that they want to talk about the reasons why it's happening.
Oh, sorry, the reasons why. Okay.
Yeah,
okay, yes.
We can do.
Well, I mean, the only yes, I've worked for many, many years in working to stop the illegal wildlife trade. And every major religion in the world has now official teachings banning the use of any endangered species, which we've worked on with many different groups dealing with those sort of issues. The issue of the live markets in China is the one story that has kind of come out, which it is probably there through bats or possibly through pangolin, these extraordinary sort of armadillo-like creatures that have become suddenly very popular in the illegal wildlife trade for traditional Chinese medicine. The sense that these viruses pass out of one species into another because we are eating species we should not be eating, basically. We are taking things from nature that should not be taken from nature. I think you're right. I think you're right. Why do I think you're right? I think there is a fundamental question that comes if we question the acceptability for the Chinese to harvest wildlife illegally in many cases and turn it into food that then breaks the chain of difference between species, then that's a whole question about to what extent do we have the right to mutate nature to our own end anyway. Now, we've been doing this for probably at least 10,000 years in terms of agriculture and the way that we have bred creatures and the way we've bred species such as wheat and so forth. We know that we have actually driven ourselves into a narrow corner of the environment, in that we now are dependent upon 4 species of grain, which were there to be an epidemic that wiped out 2 of those, we'd probably starve, because we have so managed and manipulated nature that it's to our ends, that we are no longer accessible to the sheer diversity, although Kew Gardens, which you will know in London, has set up a seed bank. The issue, I think, is that we have taken this attitude that the planet, evolution, creation, whatever you want to call it, was done for us. And there is no greater lie than that. I did geology when I was younger, and I studied the Trilobite. Now, the Trilobite is this extraordinary creature that looks like a sort of woodlice combined with a kind of prawn. And it was incredibly successful for 250 million years, and then it suddenly died out. And it went on, it did go into other species. I honestly think that the human species, I'd be amazed if we're here in a million years' time. This planet was not made to produce us, but we've lived with this myth, partly biblical, partly scientific, partly evolution, that we are the end product of some amazing process. As Psalm 8 says, you know, you've made us higher than the beasts and just lower than the angels. Well, no, actually. And evolution shows us an evolutionary tree, and guess what is sitting on the top of the tree? Oh, it's us. What a surprise. So no, I think we actually have to develop a great deal of humility. We have to recognize that we do not have the right to use nature. We have the right to take what we need, but we will also be taken in the process.
Wow. Okay. I think we have time for one more question. The question that's on my mind is, how on earth do we actually go about the rest of our day after a conversation like this? I just want to talk to you forever, Martin. I think other people feel the same way. But Paula Triana has posted that she has a question. I hope it's a quick question, and then we'll have some closing thoughts. Paula?
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I'm from Palm Beach County, Florida. I'm with the school district of Palm Beach County, the 10th largest district in the nation, with over 193,000 students and 23,000 employees. I'm the manager for wellness promotion. I have a question as far as, you know, I love the faith. You know, I'm a cancer survivor, so you know, it is through faith that all the challenges are endure. One of the things that I would like to understand, Martin, is that there are human beings that are somewhat confused. You know, I have many friends that say, you know, I just came from a witch education in England. I'm a Buddhist, I'm a pagan, I'm a Hinduist, I'm a Christian, and they want to get into the system of education to affect young minds that sometimes they don't have the wisdom and capabilities. And I feel like I'm the protector of that because
good for you. Good for
because
you.
there is a lot of confusion, and I understand. I was raised Catholic. I'm from South America, Colombia, but and I respect diversity. But again, there is a lot of confusion, and these people can be very rich and have lots of PhDs and have a lot of influence and people that follow them. But as you reach deep into them, or they're very confused, and you know, I do listen to everybody, but I also feel like I'm a little bit at
Triana, Pauline, can you just get to the question here because we're running out of time?
Okay, sorry. Thank you. Can you just give me some of your wisdom on that?
Okay, well, I began my life in setting up a multi-faith religious education center in Manchester in England. In England, across the British Isles, we have religious education as part of the national curriculum because we believe that if you don't understand the different faiths that are around you, you are actually ignorant. You can become very susceptible to lies. I also learned early on a wonderful phrase from a Hindu colleague of mine who said, evaluate the gurus you meet by their weight. The weightier they are, the worse they are, because they will have lived an indolent, financially well cushioned life. I think in terms of education, I've worked with education systems all around the world. I think what you need is that you actually need to have a committee, and in Britain, these are obligatory. Every local county has to have a faith committee. And on this, you have representatives of the major faiths in your area, or the major faiths that are represented amongst your community. And the role of that group is to review resources. And nothing goes forward into the school system until the school authorities, you in this case probably and other colleagues, sit with respectable local representatives of different traditions who evaluate the authenticity, the value, the religious value, the pedagogical value, the psychological value of the materials that you're being presented with. Because yes, every organization that wants to get control wants to get at the children. The Jesuits said, didn't they? Give me a child till he's 7 and he's mine for life. And that's true. So I think you just need to set up something that safeguards you, that also provides a structure where you can say, thank you very much indeed for your book that you sent us about how you are the reincarnated Buddha, Christ, Muhammad, etc., and how you've now come to bring entire enlightenment to the world as long as they pay you lots of money, and you'd like to put this in the schools. This will go to our subcommittee on religious values in education, and we will come back to you. Set up a group. You will find that the major faiths of all traditions will welcome being invited to consider, will welcome being invited to say what they would contribute from their millennia of running schools. 50% of all schools around the world are still faith-based, but they're faith-based within national and international educational norms and structures. So go out and get the faiths to be your buttress. And you will find that there are a lot of very, very good people who have a profound understanding of education, profound understanding of spirituality, and a very good crap detector. And that's what you need with a lot of that stuff.
I like the crap detector. That's
We're going to finish on that, aren't we, Nancy? That's going to be my final word, is crap detector.
That's some closing thought. How about, does someone have one really quick question for Martin who has not already asked a question? Karen Campbell, go ahead.
Thanks. I was pleased to hear that wellness is making it into the agenda in the Vatican. I'm just wondering if you could share with us quickly what some of the other themes that are emerging are.
Okay, wellness is one. Security is another. Both national security, personal security, because without that sense of security and family security, that whole sense of being held, economics, and the environment.
Martin, do you have one thing, a closing thought for us about wellness and faith? Something you think that, you know, we need to be doing or embracing or talking about? I mean, you raised this in Singapore. This has been another incredible conversation on the topic, but just a closing thought about that. And then I'm going to ask Susie to wrap up for us.
Okay. I suppose coming from where I come from, for me, wellness is not just about us, it's about the planet. If the planet is not well, we are not going to be well. And I think the virus has shown that incredibly powerfully. And what does wellness for the planet mean? Well, the Taoists have a wonderful phrase. They say that the Taoist view of ecology is that it is a kingdom. The whole of nature is a kingdom, and that all within that kingdom should feel held, loved, and treasured. And that if that isn't happening, then nothing is well.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And before a round of applause, I'm going to turn to Susie for a final thought.
Well, I just want to thank Martin. I want to encourage all of you to possibly listen to Martin's presentation at the summit. We have that up, and I guess also an interview. And this is also going to be available. And Martin, thank you. It means a great deal to hear your perspective and that you are part of this. And we are delighted that the Vatican is looking at wellness. We feel it is exactly the right direction, and it's a new vision forward. So I want to ask Beatrice to unmute so that we could all give you a round of applause.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you as well. Thank you all very, very much indeed. It's been an absolute joy.
Thank you.